on this Lord's Day. What the Lord's Day is the excuse we use for missing everything else. It's meeting together. On Thursdays, our Bible study, Bible Answers for Latter Days, we're covering some topics that pertain to things going on now. We just started this past week, or maybe it's our second installment of it. I think it was our first. Was about government, human government, obligations and limitations. What is our obligation to the government, and what is the limitations of our obligations? In other words, is it all out? Do we have to obey everything they tell us, or what? And so this cartoon kind of relates to that. They're saying we can have gatherings of up to 8 people without issues. I don't even know 8 people without issues. Oh, yeah. Maybe we know 2 or 3 without issues. I'm not even sure. I don't have issues. So there's no one without any issues. But anyhow, so we're in Revelation chapter 17. Revelation chapter 17. I hope you had a good week. Isn't it interesting to watch the news, listen to the news in light of what Revelation tells us? It seems like it's really putting on display what we're seeing in the text here. Revelation chapter 17, we're talking about Babylon. 17 and 18, and a little bit of 20 is about Babylon. Babylon in 2 senses. One is chapter 17, Babylon in a religious sense, and chapter 18 is Babylon in a political, economic sense. And remember, Babylon, yes, it was a place, but it also evolved into a system of mythology. It evolved into representing any government or system that is opposed to God, that God is going to use in the end times, essentially. And so we're living in the day of Babylon. You're going to see some things here that already are happening and things that will happen. So we hopefully will not be caught unprepared. Remember, Jesus said there'll be 2 people working the field, one will be taken. There'll be 2 people sleeping together, one will be taken. There used to be a song with that theme about what are you going to happen, or what are you going to do when that happens? Will you be taken or left? So we're looking at verse 1. We last week really spent the time looking at the Old Testament understanding of Babylon, and now we move into the New Testament. Basically the events in chapters 17, 18, 19 and into a little bit of 20 are events that coincide with the vial judgments. In other words, we looked in chapter 16 of those 7 vial or bowl judgments, right? And we think, oh, those ended and this is a new period of time. No, this is just 17, 18, and 19 are part of that overall final wrath of God, that final set of judgments, that final end or toward the end of the tribulation as such. And so we're gonna see that happen there. So we're going to pick up with verse number 1. Just let me look at my notes. There's a couple things I wanted to catch up with here. And what's interesting in verse 1, we looked at the first part of it, but notice it says in 17:1, and there came one of the 7 angels which had the 7 vials, and talked with me, saying unto me, Come hither, I will show unto thee the judgment of the great whore which sitteth upon many waters. The great whore is Babylon. It's identified with that by that in verse number 5. You'll see that. In fact, does verse 5, does it have these big capital letters in your? Yeah, it's like it's shouting it to us. That's what they say when you type with all capitals. It's like, turn off the cap lock key. You're shouting. But I think my dad has never discovered that. He's a spiritual typer. Seek and ye shall find. Boom, boom, and boom, and it's all capital letters. I don't know whether he wants to get attention or you just don't know there's a key to turn that off. But that's what, or the person who uses exclamation points all the time. Everything is, They end every sentence with an exclamation point. It's like, and then you never know what to take serious. But anyhow, you can see here that this angel is going to come and tell about and show about this great whore. Now, what angel is that? Well, you'll see up in chapter 16 and verse 17, the seventh angel, when he poured out his vial, it had to do with Babylon. Look at verse 19, for instance. And the great city was divided into three parts, and the cities of the nations fell, and great Babylon came into remembrance before God. So it's likely that this angel in chapter 17, verse 1, is that seventh vial angel, and he's going to expand on Babylon with John, so he can pass it on to us. But notice his invitation in verse 1, "Come, and I will show thee the judgment of the great whore." And we understand that word, used in that sense, is a female, is a woman, is a lady. I hate to use the word lady with that word, isn't it? And it's basically a promiscuous, vile type of lady. And so it's interesting. The angel says, "Come and see, and I will show you this bad woman." Now look, if you would, at 21, chapter 21. And again, one of these seven angels that had the vials full of the seven last plagues, 21:9. And John writes, "And there came unto me one of the seven angels, which had the seven vials, full of the seven last plagues, and talked with me, saying," what did he say? "Come hither," sound familiar? "And I will show thee the bride, the Lamb's wife." Now who's that? That's us. Yeah. Isn't that a contrast? Come and see. I'll show you this really bad woman. And come and see, and I will show you this good woman, the one that Jesus is going to have as his bride. I thought that was a very interesting contrast. When we're back in chapter 17 and verse 1, notice he says in that verse, "Come and I will show unto thee the what of the great whore?" The judgment of the great whore. So what we're going to see in chapter 17 and 18, and scooting into 19, a little bit of 20, is this great judgment. So this is still part of the judgment of God. In fact, if you were interested in reading the backstory of this, you would go to Isaiah and Jeremiah. Remember, we said those prophecies, particularly in the major and minor prophets, were what was called, what kind of a dual-fold prophecy? A what and a what? Yeah, we were calling a couple things far and near, past and future, or then and later. And that's what it is. Is Isaiah, for instance, chapter 13, 14, and 47. If you want to write those numbers down, it might be good when you get home to read those three chapters in Isaiah so that you'll see the backstory on this. So again, that's Isaiah 13, chapter 13, 14, and 47. Okay, and then Jeremiah is also two chapters, 50 and 51 is the backstory of this. Now, if you didn't get that, you can email me or something. I can send them to you by email if that might be more helpful to you on it. Maybe we ought to have somebody that just records all the things I need to send out after Sunday school, so nobody has to worry about missing the notes. So this is about judgment. And we're going to see several things as God, through John, describes this religious Babylon. One thing we know, that it's a counterfeit church. The religious Babylon will be a church, will be a counterfeit church. Now, years ago, when people read this prophecy, they used to think it related to just one denominational church. Now the thought is maybe it's not just one current denominational church, but maybe it will be more of a composite of a lot of those false churches that have ecumenically come into one. And anyway, it's not going to be Christ Church, is it? When you think about women in the book of Revelation, there's four essentially mentioned. Jezebel is mentioned in chapter 2. And when the seven churches are being addressed, And Jezebel's looked at as a corrupting influence in Christianity. And then you have the woman in chapter 12 of Revelation, the woman clothed with the sun. Does anyone remember what that represents? Israel, yes. And then you have here in this verse the great whore, which represents an apostate pseudo-church of the Antichrist. It's really the church of the Antichrist, isn't it? And you'll see it because she's going to be taking her power, this church, from the Antichrist. And then the one we already looked at in chapter 19, the Lamb's wife, the bride of Christ. So this church is in contrast to true New Testament Bible-believing churches. In fact, in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, in verses 1 and 2, how does Paul, and you wouldn't probably just remember this, but how does Paul describe the church there? He describes it as a chaste virgin. And then in Ephesians chapter 5, which we'll get to in verse 20, I think it's 20, let me find my note here. 25, 26, 27, in Ephesians chapter 5, Jesus uses what to describe a husband and wife relationship? He uses Christ and the church, and he describes this church as the bride of Christ. So what a contrast. You can see by using the word the great whore, it's a contrast, that church, that religion, to true religion, the true church, Christ's church. But also it's a universal church. In what sense? Well, look if you would at verse number 1, the last phrase, that setteth upon many, many waters. What does many waters mean? Well, let's look at verse 15. Somebody mentioned, did you say kingdoms, Nora? You get the points this morning for that. That's really essentially kingdoms in a sense. Look at verse 15. And he said unto me, the waters which thou sawest where the great whore setteth are what? Peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. And that's a formula that's used quite often in the book of Revelations, isn't it? So it's people groups, it's the nations, it's the political part of those nations. It's the people groups of those nations, ethnic backgrounds and so forth of those nations. So it is universal. By contrast, the Lord's church is what? It's local. 114 times in the New Testament the word church is used. It comes from the word ecclesiast. And it means essentially called out assembly. In other words, it was a word that was used when they called people out of their homes to assemble. In the Old Testament, it was used in the sense of assembling for a town meeting. Christ used the word to identify his new assembly he was gathering, the people of God in a church. And today it's translated as the English word church. It means a called out assembly. It's used 114 times in the New Testament. All but about 15 of those times is talking about a specific church in a specific location. For instance, the book of Ephesians that we're in right now, in the morning service. What church is the Ephesian church? Where was it at? Town of Ephesus, right? The one before that, Galatians, that was not a town, but that's why it says the churches of Galatia. That was a region, but they were always identified as local things, and the 15 times it wasn't, it was not talking about universal in the sense of everybody everywhere was in this church, but rather the institutional understanding of the church. For instance, if I say to you that the husband should love his wife, in fact, the Bible says that, right? Now, do you think in your mind, is there any conception in your mind that there is one universal husband and that you all somehow are married to him and a part of him, part of his bride? No, you would think, no, what that means, the husband should love husband wife, is that every husband, everywhere. It's the institution of husbandhood. Is that a word? Husbandhood? Husband? Maybe. That they should love their wife. whatever wife they have. And so those 15 times the church isn't connected to a locality. It's talking about in the sense of the institution of the church. Every church everywhere, every Bible-believing church everywhere should love their wives. So there is no universal church. That was a trapping left over from the Reformation when those guys came out but didn't come completely clearly out. But look at verse number 2. It says there, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. You're going to see that image of fornication quite often. Fornication, and you're going to see that, by the way, in Ephesians in the morning service, because it's going to contrast the love of Christ with the worldly love, and that's going to be one of the words we're going to look at. But fornication and adultery is two things that deal with sexual immorality, but they're two distinct things. They ought to be kept distinct in their definitions. Fornication is an act that only an unwed person can commit. It's someone who either does, for instance, premarital sex, cohabitating, shacking up together without being married. That person commits fornication. A person that's single that commits incest, bestiality, pedophile, those are all fornication. And by the way, that word fornication, it's a transliterated word from the Greek, and it's the same word that we, if you were to, actually it has the same form, it's just different spelling, for porno or pornography as such. And so this is what he's talking about here. He's saying fornication, that's an unmarried person committing that, because it's sexual promiscuity. Now, if a person is married, they're not committing fornication, they're committing adultery. And why that is because they have a covenant, do they not? They stood before the minister, and or the judge, whoever it was, or the captain of the ship, and said, yes, I do. So what do they actually say? What do we say again? I do. That was the words. I do, and I did, and I done it. I do. And you're entering into a covenant. And so adultery means that you have broken the covenant. So anything of those things you do, incest, bestiality, those things, as a married person, it's not fornication, it is adultery, because you're breaking the covenant and violating the covenant partner and the covenant maker, God. Now here the word fornication is used. Because see, we are engaged to Christ as the bride. But the marriage hasn't been consummated yet. Because we're still going to have the marriage of the Lamb later on. What's it called? The marriage supper of the Lamb. To show that, yes, that marriage is now consummated. So what we do, what people do before that is fornication. That's why this term is used, that this great whore has drawn people into her fornication, her perversion as such. And notice, made her drunk with the wine of her fornication. Isn't the imagery strong there? It's so, like we see a person drunk, they're overpowered, overcome, under the influence of, they say stupid things and do stupid things. And that's what this whore has done with people, seduced them as such. So let me flip my notes here. I'm trying to keep this. I want to show you something on the phone, so on the screen, so I got to keep my switcher open here. So it's a, what did we say that last one was? It's a state church because it talks about Babylon. Babylon was both a city and a town. It's a seducing church. Look at verse number 2 again. We saw this, that the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her, the whore's fornication. It's very seductive. In fact, remember we said if you want to look up a Babylon, you go to Jeremiah what? 51. 51:7 says, Babylon hath been a golden cup in the Lord's hand, that made all the earth drunken. The nations have drunken of her wine, therefore the nations are mad. Now, you wonder what's going on? You wonder how all those nations during this pandemic are all acting the same way, responding the same way, some more, some less. It's because they all been drinking from the same Kool-Aid, or in this case, the same wine. It's the whore. It's the great whore, the Babylon, that's making the nations mad. We're seeing it in what do you call that? They made movies in that color vision, or it used to be like they said, this movie has been made in Technicolor. Yes, thank you. We're dating ourselves, right? Technicolor. We're seeing it in Technicolor. Now you're saying, but that verse says, "And Babylon hath been a golden cup in the Lord's hands." Now the cup obviously is holding this wine of seduction, fornication. But what's the Lord's hand have to do with it? Well, look if you would at chapter 17 and verse 17. 17:17, "For God hath put in their hearts to fulfill his will, and to agree, and to give their kingdom unto the beast," the false or the Antichrist, "until the words of God shall be fulfilled." What's that? Yeah. It's everybody's against God. They want to eradicate God, right? But they're actually falling right into his hand. And the whore is going to do this. Babylon is going to be instrumental of that. And so you can see the connection there. It's quite interesting. The spirit of seduction is alive today. In fact, look if you would real quick at 1 Timothy 4. 1 Timothy 4. Some have a love-hate relationship with the book of Revelation. They love it in the sense that it tells them what to expect, but they really don't care for some of the things it says and what's going to happen. 1 Timothy 4:1, "The Spirit speaketh expressly in the latter times. Some shall depart from the faith." There goes your friends, huh? Some of them. "Giving heed to" what kind of spirits? "Seducing spirits and the doctrines of devils, speaking lies and hypocrisy, having their conscience seared with a hot iron." It goes into a little bit of detail of what some of that stuff's going to be like. We are in an age of seduction. And you wonder, why are people going that way? Almost I can't say every week, but at least often, maybe once a month it works out too. Trish and I are talking about a church we know somewhere in the United States that we have been to, attended a service in the past, or been part of, or been acquainted with, that has lost its way. We often talk about that. This morning we did. In fact, sometimes we just go on YouTube and Facebook for their live stream just to see, is that church we knew 5 years ago, how's it doing today? And I told one this week, Trish, one this week has just broken our heart because you can see it's going such a bad way, getting in right in with the rest of the stuff that's going on. And it's that, you say, why? Because they're seduced by a lot of things, huh? And a lot of it is the 3 Ps: fame, finances, and females. All right, I'll leave out the females because it's not your fault. But a lot of pastors that lead those churches are, in fact, tough, huh? Back to chapter 17 and verse 3 this time. Verse 3. "And so he carried me." This is the angel talking, John talking about himself, about the angel. "And so he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness. And I saw a woman set up on a scarlet-colored beast, full of the names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns." We'll talk about this heads and horns as this progresses here. So John, the angel, by the Spirit, and this is the same terminology that's used in chapter 4 of Revelation when he says, "On the Lord's day, I was taken up in the Spirit." That was a prototype rapture that we would one day experience. And so now John apparently has been taken to this vantage point out into the edge of civilization, of the wilderness, where perhaps he can see in this vision all of Babylon in her lights, in her colors, in her quote-unquote glory. And notice it says, it's a scarlet-colored beast, full of the names of blasphemy. Her entire identity is blaspheming against God. Blasphemy is when you ascribe the things of God to others. For instance, remember when Jesus cast out, and they said, well, this has been done by Beelzebub, described it to demons and devils, and he said, there'll be, all sins are forgiven you except the sin of blasphemy. And that was when they ascribed the things that Jesus did to a devil. And so the things that people should be looking at and say, look at this beautiful world that God created. Oh no, God didn't do that. Evolution did that. Or look at that person recovered, or look at the ability to create, the ability to make an invention and whatnot. Isn't man clever? Remember, it says, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Romans 1 talks about that they failed to glorify God. So man ought to always go around and say, hey, we have the MRI because of God. He gave us the ability, the knowledge, the elements in earth to create and build. God gave us the laws of nature. We say, listen, we've got a wind farm and solar energy. We're now independent. Look at what man has done. Well, who gave the sun and who gave the wind? Everything ought to be tied back to God and the glory of God. And they fail to do that. And that's what's happening here. That's blasphemy because they credit to other things. The Antichrist declares himself to be God, so he wants to be sure that God is the God of heaven. The creator God is not acknowledged. Look at verse number 4. And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. Isn't that, you got to love the language that the Authorized Version uses. So powerful and potent language on it. So what is this? This describes a pompous church, this false church, this church of the harlot, a pompous church. Notice there's two colors involved. What are they? Okay, they're purple and scarlet. Purple is the color of majesty, and scarlet is the color of sacrifice. And so that woman, that whore, is putting herself out as one of majesty and one of sacrifice, the sacrifice that she's made. And it's also a wealthy church. Notice gold and precious stones and pearls. Those are all things that are coveted. Huh? Does it say silver in there? No, I guess True's out. He's big into collecting coins, and it's all about silver coins. Huh? No silver for him. But notice the wealth. What are some of the most wealthy churches? Well, the LDS church is very wealthy. See where it was a huntsman, one of the huntsman boys. He sued the church, Mormon church, recently for, I think it was $5 million or maybe $15 million. It was a lot of money that he had tithed previously, because he said that tithe money went to build the mall in Salt Lake City that the Mormons have. Is it Gateway or City Center or whatever it is there? It actually went to court, and he lost, because they played the video of the former president when all this happened, saying that the tithes are not all used immediately, but we store them, save them for future things like building temples or whatever, and we put them in an interest-bearing account, and it's the interest that built that. So not directly your tithe money, and the judge bought that and threw his lawsuit out. He lost his lawsuit. Very wealthy. No one ever knows because they never give full disclosure of how much. Oh, yeah, tried to. Yeah. Wasn't it up into the billions with their holdings? Maybe I'm thinking of Apple instead of the Mormon Church, but which that could be a church too, the Apple Church, huh? So it's a very wealthy church. It's an immoral church. Immoral church. In verse number 4, in her hand is the golden cup. That's mentioned there again, isn't it? That's interesting. She has a cup full of something, and God has vials full of something. Hers is abominations, and God is judgments or wrath. Huh? And notice that it's full of fornications, abominations, and filthiness of her fornications. Notice in verse number 5 that not only is it a moral church in verse 4, but it's a pagan church. Look at verse 5. And upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. Now notice the terminology, Mystery, Babylon the Great. Have you ever heard some of those pagan mythology religions called mystery religions? Sometimes they'll use that terminology because this is describing that which has a secretive nature, a secretive system that only certain insiders know. There's not transparencies. These secrets are known only to the priestcraft of the movement. And by the way, again, you'll see a lot of ceremonies in some churches that are hidden from the public view, and people are sworn to secrecies. That's one of the problems with the Masons. You swear to secrecy and get your tongue cut out if you break it as such. Those secret orders, those are always problematic for believers, or should be problematic for believers. Notice this is what's called a parenting church, because in verse 5, look at the last middle phrase. She's called the mother of what? Yeah. So here she is, spawning off all these other denominations. For instance, out of the Reformation become a lot of Protestant denominations that were not entirely biblical. That they advocated such things as the sacrament nature of communion, that it gives grace and it makes a person saved. Infant baptism, infant sprinkling was another thing that they never shook off. A state church being where the church would control the state, and then later on the state tries to control the church. So this is not just one mass denomination, but she spawns off these other harlots as such. Notice verse number 6. This is, verse 6, this is, and I saw the woman drunken with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I wondered with great admonition. And that's not good admonition, that's as all struck with the gravity of something. But what's she drunk with? The blood of the saints. What a sad thing, huh? Drunk on the blood of the saints and the martyrs of Jesus Christ. So we would call this a persecuting church. This is a feature of the 70th week, the tribulation of Daniel. We've seen hundreds of thousands and millions of people that have given their life for Christ at this point on it. And in the 1700 years, basically from about 300 years after the death of Christ up until now, that 1700 years, there's been about 50 million Christians, they estimated, that have been martyred by religion. For instance, some of the reformers. Oh, we're out of time, aren't we? Hold that thought. Everybody going to remind me of the phrase? I just get going and forget what time it is. All right, let's finish in prayer. Come on in. Come on in. Come on in. I just going over. We're done. We're going to pray. Lord, thank you for this book. Help us understand how serious it is and how true it is. And Father, to order our lives to be prepared for what's there. And bless our service in just a moment. In Jesus' name.